The first thing I remember is the sting of cold water on my hands. It was just after 4 in the morning, and I was standing at the washstand in our bedroom because I had woken up aching again. The house was quiet except for the stove ticking as it cooled downstairs. My body still felt like it belonged to someone else. I was 22 years old, 3 weeks past the birth of our first child, and I was healing slower than I thought I should. I had barely slept. My nightdress stuck to my back from sweat, and every time I moved too quickly, I felt a pulling pain low in my body that made me stop and hold the edge of the table. Samuel woke when I climbed back into bed. He turned toward me and whispered something that, at first, I thought I had misunderstood. When I told him no, not yet, that I was still hurting, he sat up and said, very quietly, "A wife has no right to refuse her husband." I can still remember the exact way the moonlight fell across his face when he said it. Not angry, not shouting. Almost like he was repeating a rule he believed had already settled the matter. And what frightened me most was not his voice. It was that part of me had been taught to believe he might be right. My name is Katie. I was raised Old Order Amish, and I share these stories because there are parts of our life that are difficult to explain from the outside. Some are beautiful, some are ordinary, and some only make sense when you understand the teachings, habits, and silences that shaped us. If you have ever had to decide whether honoring a promise meant ignoring your own pain, I would be interested to know how you learned the difference. That question took me longer than I wish it had. Our baby, Ruthie, was sleeping in a wooden cradle beside the bed that morning. Samuel had made the cradle himself during the winter, shaping the runners in the workshop after chores were done. He had sanded the wood until it felt almost like polished stone, and he had carved one tiny tulip into the headboard where only we would see it. I loved him for things like that. That is important for me to say. It would be easier to tell this story if Samuel were cruel in every part of his life. He was not. He was patient with horses. He never came home from the fields without washing his boots before stepping into my kitchen. He had a habit of saving the crispest apple from the cellar for me. When my younger brother broke his wrist in a wagon accident, Samuel did his chores for 2 weeks without being asked. People can be tender in one part of themselves and deeply mistaken in another. I learned that in my marriage. Ruthie's birth had been long. I will not describe it in detail because that is not the part of the story that matters. What matters is that afterward, the midwife looked me in the eye and told me to rest. Not the kind of rest where you sit for 10 minutes before hanging laundry. Real rest. She told Samuel the same thing. I remember him nodding. I remember him carrying water upstairs for me. For the first several days, my mother came every morning after milking at their farm, bringing broth, bread, and sometimes stewed apples, because those were easy for me to eat. The women around me understood without needing much explanation. They had lived through the same kind of weakness. They knew how a body could look almost normal while still feeling bruised and fragile. By the 3rd week, though, the help began to fade. That was normal. There were cows to milk, children to teach, gardens to weed, and no one could stop working because I was tired. I also began expecting more from myself. I washed diapers at the pump, I swept the kitchen, I made a simple supper of potatoes, ham, and canned beans. I told everyone I was doing better, because that was what I wanted to be true. Samuel noticed that I was moving around more. I think, in his mind, that became proof that I had recovered. He did not know what I still felt when I climbed stairs or bent down to lift Ruthie. I did not tell him every time I hurt. In our home, people did not narrate discomfort. If your back hurt, you finished the row. If your hands cracked in winter, you rubbed salve on them and kept kneading bread. Endurance was praised so often that sometimes we mistook silence for strength. That night, before the words I told you about, Samuel had been unusually quiet. We ate supper at 6. Ruthie fussed in her cradle near the stove. Rain tapped against the kitchen window, and the yard had turned to dark mud. Samuel asked me if I felt better. I said yes. That one word became important later. I did feel better than I had the week before. I could stand longer. I could eat without feeling sick. I could carry the baby downstairs by myself. But better did not mean healed. I assumed he understood that. He assumed something else. When he spoke to me in bed, I froze. I did not know how to answer him because his sentence sounded familiar, even though no one had ever said those exact words to me before. I had heard sermons about marriage. I had heard women talk carefully about being a good wife. I had heard older girls whisper that after marriage, some things were simply expected. None of those conversations had given me language for what happened when one person was in pain and the other believed duty came first. I said, "The midwife told me I need more time." Samuel answered, "She said to rest. You are working again." I told him working was not the same thing. He looked toward the cradle. Ruthie made a small snuffling sound and settled back down. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Samuel said the sentence again, in a different way. He said he had always been taught that husband and wife belonged to each other and that refusing your spouse could become selfishness. There was no raised voice, no threat. That almost made it harder. If he had shouted, I would have known something was wrong. Instead, he sounded certain. Certainty carries weight when you have been raised to respect authority. It can make a bad idea feel like a rule of nature. I turned on my side away from him and pulled the quilt up to my shoulder. My heart was beating hard enough that I could hear it. After a while, Samuel lay back down. Nothing happened that night. I want to be clear about that. He did not force me. But the words stayed in the room with us. They changed the shape of the silence. The next morning, I woke before him and went downstairs. The rain had stopped. Fog sat low over the pasture, and everything outside looked pale and unfinished. I lit the stove, put oats in a pot, and stood there stirring while my hands shook. I kept asking myself whether I had done something wrong. That is the part I think some people outside our community find difficult to understand. Why would I even question it? Why not simply say, "My body hurts"? No. But when obedience, humility, marriage, faith, and duty have been braided together in your mind since childhood, pulling on one strand can feel like unraveling everything. I loved Samuel. I wanted to be a good wife. I wanted our home to be peaceful. I wanted to be faithful to what I had promised before God. And because I wanted those things, I was vulnerable to the idea that pain might be the price of goodness. My mother came around 10 that morning. She had Ruthie's little bonnet tucked into a basket with fresh bread and 6 brown eggs. She noticed almost immediately that I was quiet. Mothers sometimes do that. You can hide something from the whole church district and still not hide it from the woman who watched you learn to walk. She did not press me. She washed the breakfast bowls while I fed Ruthie. Then we sat at the kitchen table. The clock ticked. A fly bumped against the window. I remember all of those small sounds because I was trying so hard to decide whether I was allowed to say what was bothering me. Finally, I asked her a question without telling her the whole story. I said, "Can a wife be disobedient by saying no to her husband when she is hurting?" My mother looked at me for a long time. She did not ask what Samuel had done. She did not become dramatic. She just reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Then she said one sentence I have never forgotten. "A promise made before God is not permission to stop being kind." That was all. She did not give me a speech. She did not tell me to leave my husband. She did not condemn him. But something in me loosened when she said it. Kindness. Such a simple word. I had been trying to solve the question through obedience, hierarchy, duty, and rules. My mother brought it back to kindness. After she left, I thought about Samuel differently. Not as an authority I had to defeat, and not as a cruel man I needed to fear. I thought of him as a young husband who had inherited an idea he had never been forced to examine. Samuel was 24. We had been married a little more than a year. He knew how to build a barn door square without measuring twice, but he did not know much about a woman's recovery after childbirth. Neither did I before I lived it. In our community, some subjects were handled through experience rather than open conversation. That meant misunderstandings could survive for generations simply because no one wanted to speak plainly enough to challenge them. That evening, I decided I would. I waited until Ruthie was asleep. Samuel was at the table repairing a leather harness strap. The lamp made a yellow circle over his hands. Outside, the frogs were loud in the ditch because of the previous night's rain. I sat across from him and said, "When you told me I had no right to refuse you, I was afraid." He stopped working. I had never said anything like that to him before. Amish marriages, at least the ones I knew, did not usually involve long discussions about feelings. We talked about what needed doing, which field to plant, whether the mare was limping, who was bringing pie to a church meal, Saying, "I was afraid of you," felt enormous. Samuel stared down at the harness. He said, "I did not hurt you." I answered, "No, but I thought you believed you were allowed to." That landed differently. He looked up at me then. I explained what my body still felt like. In plain language, but without more detail than he needed, I told him the fact that I could cook supper did not mean I was ready for every part of married life. I told him I had said yes at our wedding because I wanted a life with him, not because I had signed away the right to tell him when I was in pain. My voice trembled while I said it. I wish I could tell you I sounded brave. I did not. I sounded like a young woman who was terrified she might be challenging her husband, her upbringing, and God all in the same sentence. Samuel was quiet for so long that the lamp began to sputter. Then he asked, "Did your mother tell you this?" I said, "She told me marriage does not cancel kindness." He leaned back in his chair. I could see him thinking. Samuel was not a man who changed his mind quickly. He had been raised by a father who believed a household needed one clear head. His parents were good people in many ways, but their marriage had a hardness to it that I did not want in ours. His mother almost never contradicted his father in front of anyone. At the time, I thought that was respect. Later, I wondered how much of it was habit. Samuel said he had heard men talk about a wife's duty. He said no one had ever explained where duty ended when someone was sick, injured, afraid, or recovering. I told him maybe that was the problem. That sentence felt dangerous too. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the leather strap. Then he said something I was not expecting. He said, "I thought if you refused me, it meant you did not want me anymore." Suddenly the whole conversation shifted. Under his certainty was fear. That did not make his words harmless, but it made them understandable. He had watched me spend 3 weeks focused almost entirely on Ruthie. The baby slept beside me. The baby cried for me. My mother came to help me. Samuel had gone from being the center of our little household to feeling like an extra pair of hands. He did not know how to say, "I miss my wife." So he reached for the language he had been given. Duty, rights, obligation. I told him I still loved him. I told him I missed him too. I also told him love could not make my body heal faster. He nodded. That night we made no grand agreement. There was no perfect apology with every right word. Real life usually does not give you those. Samuel said he was sorry he frightened me. I said I should have told him more clearly how much I was still hurting. We went upstairs, checked Ruthie's blanket, and lay down side by side. For the first time since the birth, he asked me, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Time." He said, "All right." It was one of the smallest conversations of our marriage, and one of the most important. The next weeks were not suddenly easy. Recovery came unevenly. Some mornings I felt almost like myself. Other days I was exhausted before noon. Samuel sometimes became impatient, though he tried not to show it. I sometimes became defensive before he had even said anything. We were learning a new way of talking, without having any model for it. There was one afternoon, about 5 weeks after Ruthie was born, when I found Samuel washing diapers at the pump. That was not considered men's work in the home I grew up in. I stood in the doorway and watched him wring out a piece of cloth with his big red hands. He looked embarrassed when he saw me. He said, "You looked tired." That was it. I went back inside before he could see me cry. People sometimes imagine change arrives through dramatic rebellion. In my life, it usually came through smaller things. A sentence at a kitchen table, a husband washing diapers, a wife saying, "I am still hurting," and being believed. The subject did not disappear from our marriage after that. Years later, when other young couples married, I sometimes heard the same old language repeated. A husband leads, a wife submits. Spouses should not deny each other. Those phrases can mean very different things depending on the heart of the person using them. I came to believe that any teaching about marriage becomes dangerous when it is used to erase the humanity of the person standing in front of you. That does not mean I stopped valuing commitment. I still believe marriage asks things from us. Patience when we are irritated, sacrifice when we are tired, loyalty when life becomes dull, forgiveness when pride would rather keep score. But sacrifice offered freely is different from pain demanded as proof of love. That difference sounds obvious to me now. It did not sound obvious at 22. Back then, I had been trained to ask, "What is expected of me?" before I asked, "What is happening inside me?" Sometimes that made me dependable. Sometimes it made me ignore warning signs. Growing older has meant learning that faithfulness and honesty are not enemies. Samuel learned too. I do not want to make him into a hero for eventually understanding something he should have understood from the beginning, but I also do not want to pretend people cannot change. He changed because the idea finally had a face, mine. Years afterward, he once told me he was ashamed when he remembered what he said that night. I told him I remembered something else too. He listened when I told him why it frightened me. That mattered. There are people who hear no as rejection. There are people who hear pain as inconvenience. There are people who have inherited beliefs they have never examined because no one around them ever did. A marriage cannot survive well if those things stay hidden. The hardest part for me was learning that speaking plainly was not the same as being disrespectful. In the world I grew up in, tone mattered, humility mattered, peace mattered. Those are not bad values. But peace that exists only because one person is afraid to speak is not the kind of peace I want in my home. When Ruthie was 6 months old, I was carrying her outside one evening while Samuel closed the chicken coop. The sky was pink over the west field. She had started grabbing everything by then, and she reached up and caught the string of my cap in her fist. Samuel laughed so hard he had to lean against the fence. I remember looking at them both and thinking how close we had come to allowing one sentence to grow into something much larger. If I had stayed silent, Samuel might have believed his understanding was correct. If he had refused to listen, I might have learned that my pain did not matter. Instead, we had an uncomfortable conversation. Sometimes that is what saves tenderness. When I look back now, the clearest lesson is not about Amish marriage specifically. It is about what happens when duty is spoken louder than compassion. Any community can do that. Any family can do that. Any person can do that. A rule can be useful, but a rule cannot feel pain. A tradition can carry wisdom, but a tradition cannot look into the eyes of the person beside you and decide what kindness requires in that exact moment. We have to do that ourselves. If I could sit beside my 22-year-old self at that washstand in the dark, I would tell her something I did not know yet. You are allowed to describe your pain plainly. You are allowed to ask the person who loves you to care about it. And a good marriage does not become weaker because two people can say no, not yet, I am afraid, I need time, or please listen to me. Those words can protect love. They protected ours. Samuel and I never became people who talked endlessly about every emotion. That would not have been natural for either of us. But after that season, there was one question we asked more often. What do you need? Sometimes the answer was help carrying water. Sometimes it was an hour of quiet. Sometimes it was forgiveness. Sometimes it was simply time. That question made our home gentler. And when I think about the morning after Samuel told me a wife had no right to refuse, I no longer remember only the fear. I remember the fog over the pasture. I remember my mother's hand over mine. I remember the lamp over Samuel's workbench, and the way his face changed when he finally understood what his words had sounded like to me. Most of all, I remember discovering that obedience without kindness was not the kind of marriage I wanted to build. If you have ever had to unlearn an idea about marriage, family, faith, or duty that you once accepted without questioning, tell me what helped you see it differently. And if you want more stories about the parts of Amish life that are quiet, complicated, ordinary, and sometimes difficult to explain from the outside, you can subscribe and come back for the next one. I share a new story each week.